Another urgent priority for bringing down the cost of living is to stop the colossal fraud that is bleeding American taxpayers absolutely dry. The fraud being committed by the Somali population in Minnesota. Have you heard of them? They're lovely people.
Federal inspection launched. One of the most urgent steps in reducing the cost of living is stopping the massive fraud draining American taxpayers at an alarming rate. For years, a complex financial operation quietly exploited federal assistance programs, hiding behind paperwork, approvals, and trust. At 6:42 a.m., federal authorities moved. The administration authorized action against thousands of individuals tied to one of the largest public fund fraud investigations ever uncovered in Minnesota. What began as a childcare subsidy review quickly unraveled into a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise. More than 750 children were officially listed in care records. None of them could be found. Over $8 billion in public funds had been issued through the program. Nearly $400 million had already vanished through a tightly coordinated network. They never expected the inspection. If you want the truth they didn't want exposed, hit like. This story goes much deeper. 6:42 a.m., Minneapolis, Minnesota. The city was still asleep. The temperature hovered at 11 degrees Fahrenheit, the cold pressing the streets into silence. In the Southern District, empty roads reflected streetlights off frozen pavement. The only movement came from the steady exhaust of an unmarked SUV parked along the curb. Inside sat 21 federal inspectors, a joint task force from the FBI and the Department of Health and Human Services. They weren't hunting drug dealers. They weren't making arrests. On paper, their assignment was routine, a compliance inspection of a state-licensed childcare facility. The center was operated by Nimco Ali Hassan, age 45, a figure well known in local leadership and administrative circles. Public records showed that over 6 years, her facilities had received tens of millions of dollars in federal child care assistance. And yet, something was off. The sign outside the building was poorly made. The word learning was misspelled. Inside state databases, however, the operation appeared flawless. According to filings, Hassan controlled 5 licensed child care centers across residential neighborhoods in the Twin Cities. Enrollment records listed over 750 children receiving full-time daily care. With numbers that high, government payments flowed continuously, unchecked, uninterrupted. That morning, federal and state agents executed a coordinated entry into the South Minneapolis location. A connected partner business tied to the same ownership structure had already triggered multiple billing fraud alerts. Over 5 years, transfers linked to the network exceeded $8 billion. As inspectors approached the entrance, something felt wrong. The building was silent. No parents, no staff, no children. The lead inspector forced the door open. Inside, the air was cold and stale. The rooms were perfectly arranged, too perfect. Toys sat neatly on shelves, untouched, layered with dust. Cribs stood fully assembled in the infant room, mattresses spotless, unused. An attendance board hung on the wall. Every space was filled in, every name checked, every time slot marked. But the rooms showed no sign of life. Over the previous 12 months alone, this single center had collected more than $46 million in taxpayer funding. There was no evidence that even one child had spent a full day there. Inside Hassan's private office, investigators uncovered the framework of the operation. A thick binder sat inside a locked cabinet. Page after page listed children, over 700 of them. None were real. The system relied on fabricated identities, created by combining real social security numbers purchased illegally with forged birth certificates. These ghost children existed only inside payment systems, allowing funds intended for low-income families to be siphoned undetected. More than $250 million was stolen through this mechanism alone. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Inside a steel safe, agents found $38 million in cash, tightly sealed in black plastic. Resting on top were 5 sealed packages containing approximately 270 kilograms of narcotics, marked with cartel identifiers. At that moment, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't simple benefits fraud. This wasn't administrative corruption. This facility was functioning as a money laundering hub, operating under the cover of a childcare license. It wasn't a daycare. It was a financial clearinghouse funded by American taxpayer dollars. If you believe stealing money meant for vulnerable children must be condemned, like this video, subscribe to Cipher Dossier, and comment justice below. The inspection instantly transformed into a federal crime scene. By mid-morning, auditors launched an intensive review of licensing and oversight records. What they uncovered defied basic logic. Documents showed that Hassan, along with a relative listed as a municipal official, was authorized to supervise multiple facilities simultaneously. Birth dates were duplicated. Children were reassigned across locations. Warning flags multiplied. At this stage, 93 individuals had been charged, connected to both financial crimes and narcotics distribution. From 2021 to 2025, reimbursements linked to the network totaled $8 billion. Oversight was almost non-existent. In certain months, deposits exceeded $74 million. Funds moved through 43 intermediary accounts, cycling back into state systems to mask their origin. Less than 4% could be tied to legitimate expenses such as food, rent, or wages. There were no supplier contracts, no maintenance costs, no payroll records. The data told the real story. Money was transferred offshore in calculated waves. Each transaction kept just below federal reporting thresholds. In under 9 months, over $400 million moved through a single account without paying a single employee. Funds were routed internationally to East Africa, the Middle East, and drug production corridors in Mexico. In just 3 years, more than 2 tons of narcotics entered the United States. This operation didn't survive by hiding. It survived by blending in. Behind flawless paperwork was a machine engineered to extract billions. Investigators later uncovered staged activity meant to deceive neighbors and inspectors. Digital schedules labeled simulated shifts detailed paid actors arriving during pickup hours. Hidden speakers played recordings of children laughing. Vehicles were rotated between locations to preserve the illusion. It was a performance designed for one audience only, the state inspector. By nightfall, the investigation shifted. This was no longer an audit. It was a hunt. If you believe federal agents can dismantle this multi-billion-dollar extraction network, comment destroy. Utility records finally exposed what paperwork had concealed. Electricity consumption surged every night far beyond residential or commercial norms. Water usage exceeded 90,000 gallons per day, levels consistent with heavy industrial processing rather than storage or logistics. These patterns repeated with mathematical precision. At 3:06 a.m., aerial surveillance drones confirmed sustained activity. Vehicles entered the compound on rigid schedules. No randomness, no variation. Exhaust plumes poured steadily from multiple ventilation shafts, thick and continuous. This was not a warehouse. This was an active production facility, financed with money stolen from Minnesota's most vulnerable children. At 4:21 a.m., the final authorization was given. Entry was approved. Headlights sliced through the darkness as federal tactical teams advanced toward the primary access points. From the outside, the structure no longer resembled an abandoned industrial site. Reinforced walls, restricted angles, and hardened entryways revealed its true purpose. It was fortified. The initial breach was silent. A controlled charge shattered a reinforced steel door, collapsing inward with surgical precision. Seconds later, the silence broke. Gunfire erupted. Cartel operatives inside the facility opened fire as federal teams pushed through the breach point. Muzzle flashes ignited the corridors. Agents returned fire, taking cover behind structural supports as rounds tore through the air. The exchange was short and violent. Tactical units advanced in disciplined formation, clearing rooms under live fire, isolating resistance, node by node. Within 10 minutes, the defense collapsed. 19 cartel members were subdued on site. 3 suffered minor injuries. The remaining suspects were restrained, forced to their knees, and secured at gunpoint. The facility was contained. Inside, the air was oppressive. Not just hot, toxic. Agents reported a metallic taste the moment internal seals were breached. Industrial-grade filtration systems lined the walls, running at maximum output to mask chemical emissions from thermal and satellite detection systems. Conveyor belts were still moving. Production counters continued climbing. Beyond a secondary corridor, teams uncovered the human cost. Inside a windowless detention room, 62 people were found alive. 17 were U.S. citizens. The rest came from multiple countries. Several had been reported missing 6 to 9 months earlier. They sat on the floor, malnourished, dehydrated, terrified. One man's heart rate barely registered above 40 beats per minute. Medical teams stabilized him immediately. These workers were not simply prisoners. They were erased. Their fingerprints had been chemically burned with acid, deliberately destroyed to prevent identification if they ever escaped. This was the cartel's insurance policy: protection against traceability, against testimony, against accountability. As rescue teams evacuated the detainees, evidence units advanced deeper into the production sector. What they discovered stunned even veteran agents. Stolen childcare subsidies had been used to purchase precursor chemicals at industrial scale. Financial ledgers documented $1 billion in chemical acquisitions over just 18 months. The factory's output was staggering: between 32 and 38 tons of fentanyl per day, more than 71 tons of cocaine per week. It was a closed system. The government funded childcare. Childcare laundered the money. The money fueled drug production. The drugs devastated communities. By 5:19 a.m., the full scale was undeniable. The operation spanned 4 floors. One internal log documented a single week's output valued at $3.2 billion. As dawn broke, the complex was fully secured. The silence afterward was unbearable. If you believe the United States needs a comprehensive audit of every welfare program, comment accountability below. At 10:26 a.m., federal briefings began inside a secured facility. Confirmed losses to taxpayers now exceeded $7.3 billion, money that never reached the families it was meant to support. Investigators concluded that more than 70,000 low-income children statewide lost access to childcare services after funds were diverted into this criminal network. Legitimate providers collapsed. They couldn't compete with centers that paid no food costs, no wages, and no maintenance expenses. In several neighborhoods, licensed childcare capacity fell by nearly 22%, leaving working families with no options. The system wasn't blind. It chose not to see. Approvals became automatic. Oversight became procedural. In a framework designed for speed, repetition was mistaken for reliability, and volume was mistaken for legitimacy. This case forced a hard reckoning with the vulnerabilities embedded inside the American welfare system. For years, the priority had been access, moving funds quickly to those in need. But speed eliminated verification. Safeguards were loosened. Exceptions became routine. Warning signs were buried beneath administrative momentum. The Ghost Children Network exploited compassion itself. Officials feared asking difficult questions. The network understood that fear and weaponized it, using political sensitivity, regulatory fatigue, and institutional caution to steal billions in plain sight. The investigation into Nimco Ali Hassan proved that the most dangerous criminals don't always look like criminals. Sometimes they look respectable. They attend meetings. They follow procedures. They file perfect paperwork. And they steal the future openly. This was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of accountability. Red flags appeared again and again: duplicated addresses, recycled identities, impossible enrollment growth. Each signal was dismissed in favor of continuity. The factory was shut down. Accounts were frozen. Assets were seized. But the deeper question remains. How many empty facilities are operating right now, collecting millions while delivering nothing? How many programs report perfect compliance while producing zero impact? How many systems reward silence over scrutiny? This case exposed a truth that can no longer be ignored. When oversight becomes ceremonial, fraud becomes inevitable. Compassion without verification becomes an invitation. When institutions prioritize speed over integrity, exploitation follows. The damage isn't measured only in dollars. It's measured in lost childhoods, closed businesses, and broken trust. The lesson is unavoidable. Accountability is not optional. Machines can be rebuilt. Funds can be recovered. But unless the culture changes, unless questions are welcomed and verification restored, the same vulnerabilities will be exploited again by actors just as patient, disciplined, and invisible. When the doors were sealed and the lights went out, Minneapolis didn't feel relief. It felt hollow. Within 72 hours, consequences rippled outward. More than 18,000 families received notices that childcare placements were suspended or terminated. Parents who had built their work lives around licensed care suddenly had nothing. By week's end, employment offices reported a 14% spike in emergency leave requests, overwhelmingly from single parents and grandparents raising children. This wasn't inconvenience. It was economic shock. Investigators confirmed that at least 146 legitimate providers had already closed over 3 years, unable to compete with fraudulent centers paying zero operating costs. Those closures were not accidental. They were the silent casualties of systemic failure. In working-class neighborhoods, childcare capacity collapsed by nearly 22%, creating what officials quietly labeled care deserts. The numbers were devastating. The human cost was worse. State analysts confirmed that more than 70,000 children lost access to early care. Toddlers missing meals, children losing structure, families pushed into survival mode. One internal assessment revealed the immediate economic damage to households caught in the collapse. Families affected by the shutdown lost an average of $1,400 per month in wages due to missed work and forced absences. For households already living paycheck to paycheck, the loss was devastating. In immigrant communities, fear replaced trust almost overnight. Attendance at community centers dropped between 30 and 40% as parents withdrew from public spaces, worried that any interaction with social services might bring unwanted scrutiny. The irony was cruel. Thousands of innocent families, already struggling, paid the price for a scheme they had no role in and no knowledge of. The silence that followed was not ignorance. It was self-protection. City infrastructure began to buckle under the strain. Requests for emergency assistance surged 19% in a single month. Food banks reported record demand. Shelters quietly prepared for an influx they knew they could not sustain. Minneapolis did not just lose money. It lost stability. And the most unsettling realization came not from what investigators uncovered, but from what they did not find. There were no alarms, no system crashes, no dramatic failures. The welfare system had not broken. The fraud had coexisted with it, undetected, for years. The paperwork was immaculate. The forms were flawless. Approvals never slowed. The system performed exactly as designed, moved money quickly, efficiently, and without asking uncomfortable questions. By the time the truth emerged, the city had already been hollowed out. This was not only a criminal operation stealing billions. It was a slow extraction of opportunity carried out in plain sight. Legitimate businesses collapsed. Families lost livelihoods. Children lost time that can never be recovered. Trust, once fractured, did not return with press briefings or public statements. As Minneapolis struggled to regain its footing, one reality became impossible to avoid. The cost of this operation could not be measured solely in dollars. It was measured in closed classrooms, emptied neighborhoods, and exhausted parents staring at calendars they could no longer control. The raid ended the scheme. What it left behind was a city forced to confront damage it never realized was happening. When the dust finally settled, a harder truth emerged. This operation did not survive because it was hidden. It survived because it was allowed. As investigators moved beyond crime scenes and into administrative records, focus shifted away from Nimco Ali Hassan herself. The central question was no longer what she did. It was who enabled it. Over a 5-year period, her network received more than 1,200 approvals from state and municipal agencies. License renewals were granted automatically. Payment authorizations were signed in batches. In some instances, a single official approved over $94 million in reimbursements within 48 hours, without conducting a single on-site verification. This was not isolated negligence. It was repetition. It was routine. Audit logs revealed that at least 17 red flags were formally documented and dismissed. Duplicate child identities, identical enrollment lists across separate facilities, centers reporting perfect attendance 365 days a year, including holidays and blizzards. One location claimed to care for 163 infants with a staff of 2. No follow-up occurred. Why? Because the system rewarded speed, not scrutiny. Between 2020 and 2024, Minnesota expanded emergency childcare funding by nearly 62%, driven by political pressure to distribute aid rapidly. Verification requirements were quietly reduced. Physical inspections dropped 41% statewide. In several districts, inspectors were instructed to rely on documentation instead of in-person checks. Paper replaced presence. Forms replaced reality. And the forms were perfect. Investigators later confirmed that the same approval signatures appeared on over 70% of reimbursements linked to the network. These were not junior clerks. They were senior administrators, insulated by procedure. No bribes were documented. No envelopes of cash exchanged hands. What existed instead was more dangerous. Institutional comfort. No one wanted to be the person who slowed the process. No one wanted to ask questions that could be misinterpreted. No one wanted to challenge a community figure whose paperwork never showed an error. Silence became policy. Meeting transcripts revealed the pattern. Concerns were raised briefly, then redirected. Phrases like "no actionable discrepancy" and "within acceptable variance" appeared repeatedly. In one recorded meeting, an analyst questioned how a single operator could manage 5 high-capacity centers simultaneously. The response was entered into the record. High volume indicates success and system efficiency. Volume did not indicate success. Volume concealed theft. By the end of 2023, the network had cycled funds through 43 intermediary accounts, all of which passed compliance checks. Not one triggered escalation. Not one was frozen until federal intervention. The system did not fail loudly. It failed quietly and consistently. This was not about one corrupt official. It was about a culture that mistook repetition for legitimacy and politeness for integrity. The machinery functioned flawlessly while billions disappeared. And that is the most uncomfortable truth. This network did not break the system. It used it exactly as designed, choosing convenience over confrontation, speed over verification. The doors were not forced open. They were held open, signature after signature, until the cost could no longer be ignored. When the final accounts were frozen and the last file closed, the investigation reached its legal end. The moral reckoning had only begun. The collapse of the network forced an uncomfortable realization at the highest levels of government. This was not an anomaly. It was a repeatable model, one that required no hacking, no violence, no manipulation of code, only patience, paperwork, and silence. Federal analysts issued a warning that never reached the public. Conservative modeling suggested that similar welfare-linked fraud structures could be operating in as many as 14 states, hidden inside emergency programs designed to move money fast. If just 1% of national childcare and social service funding were compromised at comparable scale, annual losses would exceed $32 billion. That number alone should stop anyone cold. But the danger was never only financial. Investigators identified a structural weakness shared by nearly every modern welfare system: compassion without verification. Programs designed to help vulnerable populations intentionally reduced friction. Oversight was minimized to prevent delays. Questions were discouraged to avoid offense. Speed became the highest virtue, and speed erased accountability. Auditors nationwide flagged thousands of facilities reporting perfect compliance. No absences, no complaints, no irregular expenses. In theory, perfection looked admirable. In reality, it was impossible. One internal review showed that fewer than 0.3% of legitimate childcare centers maintain full enrollment year-round. Yet, in emergency-funded programs, that number surged beyond 11%. No alarms were triggered. The system rewarded those who blended in. The most chilling discovery was how easily trust became a weapon. The network did not threaten regulators. It did not bribe them. It relied on something far more reliable: fear. Fear of asking difficult questions. Inspectors deferred. Administrators approved. Everyone assumed someone else was checking. No one was. By the time the truth surfaced, the damage extended far beyond Minnesota. Financial trails linked stolen funds to drug production, human trafficking, and offshore laundering. Every dollar diverted multiplied harm downstream: overdoses, violence, missing people, destabilized communities. The system was not merely robbed. It was turned against itself. For older Americans watching this unfold, the implications were especially stark. These programs were built over generations, funded by decades of public trust. They were meant to protect children and families. Instead, they became pipelines for exploitation. The final audit estimated that more than 110,000 children nationwide may have been indirectly affected by similar schemes. Children whose names were used, whose funding was claimed, and who never received a single service. Childhood is not refundable. Time cannot be reimbursed. The factories were shut down. The accounts were seized. The headlines moved on. But the question refused to disappear. How many empty buildings are still operating today? How many programs report flawless compliance while delivering nothing? How many officials sleep well, reassured by paperwork that looks correct, while reality goes unchecked? This case revealed a brutal truth. When oversight becomes ceremonial, fraud becomes inevitable. When systems prioritize speed over integrity, exploitation is not an accident, it is the outcome. And when institutions punish scrutiny more than theft, silence becomes the most valuable currency of all. The machines can be rebuilt, the funds can be recovered, but unless the culture changes, unless questions are welcomed and verification becomes non-negotiable, the same blueprint will be reused by actors just as patient, disciplined, and invisible. Accountability is not optional. It is the only defense left.